I'm Counselor Rugg. We have Counselor Thompson and Counselor Allen.
Okay, with me today is Mary Palomino and Tanya Budge. They are the brains behind the audit. As you alluded to, Counselor Rudd, I'm going to do a high-level presentation, and what I did is I've kind of summarized that big stack of documents that you have in front of you. We'd be here for a very long time if we tried to go through all that. So, that being said, we'll jump right into it on page 1. So what is it that we were engaged to do? This is the scope of services that we performed. We performed an audit of your financial statements. We performed an audit of your federal awards, also known as the single audit. And we performed an audit of your New York State DOT funds. So those are the three main objectives of the audit. Over on page 2, the executive summary, how did that audit turn out? Our primary responsibility is to give an opinion on those financial statements. What we have is an unmodified opinion on those financial statements, meaning we believe everything is fairly stated in all material respects. So a clean audit opinion, this is the highest level of assurance that we can give you guys. Along with that, we're required to assess your internal controls. We did identify certain deficiencies that we consider to be material weaknesses. We'll go over those in a little while, also known as the findings. There were material audit adjustments identified in performing the audit. Again, those are what we consider to be material weakness. Your auditor cannot be part of your internal control. If we come in and we're proposing journal entries, that means we're, in essence, part of your internal controls. We'll talk about that. Accounting policies and estimates. This year, the one that we'll talk about is GASB 75. Again, this is the recording of your post-employment benefits other than pensions. And again, we'll hit the highlights of that in just a second. The single audits were required to give an opinion on compliance with your federal programs. Again, that's an unmodified opinion. We believe that you complied in all material respects with the federal regulations. Same thing with the New York State regulations. With regard to New York State, we did identify a deficiency there that we'll talk about. So this is very similar to last year. Basically all those same things applied last year, and we're going to talk about the things that recurred when we get to the findings and the things that are new. Over on page 4.
Things that were eliminated too, or fixed, I guess?
Were there? Not much, I don't think.
Okay.
I think the basic things, yes, we did get rid of the federal finding, as a matter of fact. There were no federal findings last year, which, again, is a good thing. That's going to elicit the most attention from the federal agencies. They're going to require a response to that. So that one was gone. But when we get to the findings, we'll talk about those that have recurred and why they're important. Over on page 4, I just pointed out a few things with regard to the financial statements. And I think one thing that I always point out is the timing of this audit. This is for the year ended June 30, 18. We're here essentially 2 months before the next year is ended. Not an ideal situation. These numbers become stale fairly quickly. So again, that's part of the reason we don't spend a ton of time on it at this point. You guys are already aware where you are for the next year.
When should we do this then?
I mean, in my mind, this audit would be done by no later than 12/31.
But the primary cause of the delay is the airport numbers, right?
The airport is part of it, yes, but quite honestly, we haven't been done either. So, our goal has been the last 2 years, January 31, we haven't been there. And again, we'll talk about that when we hit the findings, what some of those causes are and what are some of the things that I think we can do about that. With regard to the financial statements, so you have two types of financial statements. You have the government-wide financial statements and the fund financial statements. The government-wide financial statements captures all the liabilities and assets of the city. So that's your long-term debt, your capital assets, Again, as I've said in the past, is this a really meaningful statement? Probably not from your perspective. You guys budget on an annual basis. A lot of these liabilities are over the life of, both pensions and OPEB. The second bullet there talks about that pension liability being $28 million on the government activities and $1.9 million on the business type activities. Again, that's an estimate. Your actual contributions to the New York State plans were $53 million. So that's your annual contribution, including the school district. I'll point that out too. Again, when we're talking about government-wide, that's the entire entity. One thing to note there is the state plan obviously has assets in it. And this is just the remaining liability you have there. With regard to other post-employment benefits, again, this is retiree health insurance. So in the past, you were allowed to take on a small piece of that liability. This year, you were required to take on that entire liability. Going to bullet one there, you see a deficit of net position of $918 million, a giant number. Basically, you're in the hole $1 billion based on recording of that liability, which is for the government type activities, $1.5 billion. So again, what does this mean? This means this is the number that you expect to pay for your employees, all of your employees and all of your retirees over eternity. When you're budgeting on an annual basis, again, you're not going to consider the $1.5 billion. The only value, in my opinion, is potentially comparing this to other governments. That's it. It's not something you're going to look at on an annual basis. Your payments are still going to be on a pay-as-you-go basis. The state does not allow you to accumulate assets to pay for these over time. So on a pay-as-you-go basis, your payments were about $43.5 million this year. Those are the important numbers there. It's easy to get lost in that giant deficit, but again, this is over time. Any questions about that?
I've always thought that like one of the principles of government is you want those who benefit to pay, and that includes like you pay when, so you want the citizens who are getting the services today to pay the taxes today instead of tomorrow. So
Right.
Historically, like pensions have been a cost that has been pushed into the future. So it's basically the cost of paying for yesterday's services. So the thing that I think could be interesting, I mean, I know it's a new number, right? We didn't calculate it for a long time, but in theory, the city's always subsidized its current services by pushing a load to the future taxpayers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really indicative of just how much we're pushing into the future, right? Because
Right.
we're basically saying like, because we don't actually have that person picking up the trash can 10 years from now when they're retired and we're paying for them, right?
Right, right, exactly. I mean, this is the cost of, we're calculating costs now for, current employees. So your actual costs are going to be your current employees' healthcare and those that are retired right now, which again already provided that service to you. So again, it kind of, that's why, flipping over to page
So
5.
we've had that number for how many years at this point?
Well, you've always had that number in the financial statements in the footnotes, but now it's actually recorded in its entirety on the face of the financial statements. So,
Do you know if it's gone up much over time, or was it like once we acknowledge it, it basically stays kind of stable over time?
it's evaluated basically every 2 years by your actuary. So there's I don't know how many pages of notes in there, describing all the factors that go in there. But they're looking at healthcare trends. They're looking at mortality tables. Those are all the factors that they're putting in there. They're looking at the demographics of your current employees and how long until they retire. So again, that's one giant estimate. It's really hard to, and it's adjusted every year, and sometimes the swings are pretty wild swings,
Okay,
quite
so it
honestly.
does change quite a bit depending on the projection.
Yeah.
That's cool. We can go past it. I realize it's probably not the most important number.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, over on page 5 are the fund financial statements. I'm really just gonna highlight a few things from the general fund here. General fund, the operating fund of the city. And basically, this kind of mirrors your budget. So the city's general fund for this year was expected to use approximately $16.5 million of fund balance. In reality, you increased your fund balance by about $800,000. Part of that, you know, the next two bullets kind of show what happened there. You had a increase of sales tax, which everyone expected, of almost $6 million. And you budgeted to increase it by just about $2 million. So
The school district had a almost $15 million increase in their fund balance.
they did. They did.
From the state last year, I think, but was that a pop from the state last year?
Yes, it was. Yep.
Was it a one-time kind of thing, or what?
No, I think that was just an increase that they hadn't planned for at that point.
It was after the tax, after everything happened.
Right.
I can remember we finished the budget and everything else, and all of a sudden,
Right.
yeah.
So those are two pretty big swings there. Expenditures were about $11 million below budget. And again, this has been consistent with the past few years. The expenditures have been far less, I think largely in part to unfilled positions. So over on page 6,
So the variation for the city, is like 17.4,
right.
and then the variation for the school district is almost 26 million.
Right.
Great, thanks.
So over on page 6, I've included a table that I've included the past few years of your unassigned fund balance, which is essentially your savings account for the gen fund. As you can see, it's trended down, it's trended back up a little bit this year. I think one of the things I'll point out is if you actually spent what you budgeted to spend for the last 3 years, you'd have used up all 42 million that you have right now, and you'd be 3 million in the hole. So just something to keep in mind. Those surpluses have certainly helped kind of keep that number up there. Where did those surpluses come from?
So the variation on the chart, it shows 2017 is 36 million and 2018 is 42 million, so 6 million difference. But on the previous page, you had showed 800,000 difference.
Right,
So how
that's
do
just-
I reconcile that?
In the 800,000 was all of the fund balance. So within fund balance, you have 3 different types of fund balance. Essentially, you have restricted, assigned, and unassigned. So the unassigned is purely, you can do what you want with it. The assigned is what you budget basically for next year's either this year's encumbrances you haven't spent or next year's budget. So that's where the real swing happened there. So the assigned fund balance went down by 5, and it shifted over to unassigned.
Oh, because it was reserved for the previous year, and then it got
Right.
freed up when we closed our books.
And
I gotcha.
you basically set aside less for this year, for this current year's budget than you did
Right,
in the prior year.
16 and a half to 11.
Right, exactly. So that's kind of where the swing was there.
Last year, we had a comment about trajectory, the importance of the trajectory of this fund balance number and how it had been going down, so that was concerning, and how as a percentage of our operating budget,
Right.
it actually, by the standard you described last year, it wasn't that bad. The concern was really the downward trajectory.
Exactly.
So to the extent this number went up again, that would begin to be like a positive accomplishment, I
Yeah,
guess, right?
absolutely.
Makes it so.
The way everybody kind of looks at it a little bit different. I always look at it as a percentage of your gen fund expenditures, and that's about 19% you're unassigned. Last year it was about 16%. And essentially that's 2 months worth of expenditures. So you could run the city on that for essentially 2 months with no other revenues. To me, anything less than that, you're starting to get pretty thin. New York State would probably disagree with me pretty strongly.
The school, last year you also described this, how school districts have a 4%
Right.
target or cap or whatever it
Right.
is for their fund balance. So what's the school district's current fund balance, given that they just added 14 million to it?
I don't think the city school district has that same cap. I believe they're at about 7%, if I remember correctly. The big five school districts, I don't think,
Okay.
I
Have
don't
that
think it
same.
applies to them. But every other school district is 4%, so, again, when you're at 4%, that's pretty lean. I mean, one event could wipe out your entire fund balance. So, to me, to be around 15% is you're healthy, you're in good shape to take care of the city at that point.
You said ours is at 7?
No, yours is at about 19% for the city. The school district's at about 7%.
Okay, that's all.
Right.
So 7% for the school district is like 30 million?
Yeah,
Is
we
it
could-
in here? It's not in here. Is it?
Yeah, it's, let's see, actually, I can tell you. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell because we have to roll up the district's unassigned fund balance gets rolled up into assigned for you guys, because you could, basically government accounting rules, but they're at about 54 million in assigned fund balance. So that would include their unassigned, that they consider to be unassigned, and anything that they have budgeted for the 18-19 budget, so. It's a little bit different. Over on page 7, again, just to kind of to show you the revenues and expenditures. I mean, you look at it, the revenues have trended up, the expenditures have remained the same. Again, that's why you're holding on to that fund balance. That was the big picture financial statement overview. Any questions about the financial statements themselves before we talk about the findings?
General fund revenue. So on 7, the distance between revenues and expenditures stays kind of similar, but both go up.
Right.
So I guess the gap becomes a smaller percentage of the whole. Is that good, or should the gap get, I guess the gap,
Well, again, this goes to your previous comment about matching, services and taxes with, your current citizens. So in theory, they should be relatively, the same. If you're accumulating fund balance year after year after year, I mean, the criticism is you're overtaxing.
Yeah.
You're holding on to fund balance for future citizens of the city of Syracuse. So they should trend the same. I mean, you're gonna tax and provide services for the current year, for, in this case, 18-19, But again, you always have to have some in reserve, because there are things that happen that are beyond your control. The sales tax, for instance, you budget for sales tax on an annual basis. We kind of have a sense of how that can go, but, I mean, certainly that could drop off very quickly too. We've enjoyed the last couple of years of trending up, but prior to that, we had a couple of years where it trended down. So there are things that are tough to predict in there, and you kind of need that cushion for those type of things.
thank you.
Page 8 and 9 are the findings, and we basically summarized them here. Findings 1, 2, and 3 are the same findings that we've talked about since 2010 and 2011 for numbers 2 and 3. Finding 1 is related to those adjusting journal entries that we've made. Again, we shouldn't be making those journal entries on an annual basis. I will note they weren't in the general fund, they were in the other funds, the capital projects fund, the aviation fund, sewer and water funds. We still are required to give opinions on each one of those funds. Without these journal entries, we would not have had a clean opinion. So again, necessary journal entries. Again, we're becoming part of your accounting team, essentially.
And the reason for that was?
Basically, just, they didn't make the entries.
They weren't input.
These were accounting entries that weren't booked by the Bureau of Accounts or, you know, aviation department, sewer and water. Or they weren't aware that they needed to be booked, which, again, they've had some turnover in Bureau of Accounts. That contributed to some of this too.
In your experience, how, like, do governments or municipalities, is it common for these recurring findings?
It's not common to have the number of journal entries that we had. Let's put it that way.
So are the number of journal entries comparable year over year, or is it getting worse, or are they getting more?
I think they've been consistent for the past few years. And there's a lot. I mean, and that's part of the reason we're here in April and we're not here in January. Quite frankly, there's a lot of back and forth between my team and Bureau of Accounts to try to get where we think we can give it a clean opinion on the financial statements, and that's the nature of that finding. Is what happens to get us to that clean opinion. In your packet is a listing of all those journal entries. I mean, you can kind of see the volume of them when you look at that. So that'll give you a sense of, there's a lot there that changed. Finding 2 is grants management. Again, this is a finding that we've been recommending for a few years now. Essentially, you have a lot of grants. They need to be monitored. Revenue needs to be booked when you're incurring expenses that are reimbursable. So that revenue needs to be booked to basically get everything in the proper period. One of the big things that we do is the audit of the federal awards. We call that the CFA. That's the basis for our audit. We have to audit your major programs, basically your biggest programs. And to get us to the point where we're auditing the right programs, we had to do adjustments to the CFA too. So again, that's going to slow things down too when we're not in a position to start the audit of those federal programs, because we're still trying to nail down the numbers of getting us to the right programs. Finding 3 is, in my opinion, probably the least concerning. Again, we do have to give an opinion on those government-wide financial statements, so your capital assets do need to be stated properly. And it is tough for governments to track. This one is a common finding for governments. Again, because when we're talking about recording buildings and trucks and cars and all the things you buy, on an annual basis, once you've paid for them, they kind of fall, you know, out of the minds of the accountants, let's put it that way. We have to track them, we have to depreciate them, and that's what you see on your financial statements. You'll see net capital assets of over $700 million. Again, those are all paid for in most cases. So once you get beyond the payment of those out of your budget cycle, essentially, then it just becomes accounting entries. You know, the likelihood of anything really becoming of those is very, very slim at this point. So, but again, it's a requirement, and your rating agencies would not be happy if we decided to give you a qualified opinion on capital assets. Capital projects. So this is the only new finding for this year. And essentially this kind of piggybacks off of findings 2, where we're talking about kind of that global overview of some of your financial transactions. So there's 3 ways that funds get into your capital projects. You have the local appropriation by the council. You have grants and you have bonds. Those are the three ways we pay for capital projects. When you look at the fund balance for capital projects, you'll see committed and restricted. Restricted is those funds that come from bonds and sometimes grants. And then the committed is the local appropriations. So again, that money's transferred in there on an annual basis. And what we're suggesting here with this finding is there are projects that don't start in a timely manner. Those funds build up in the capital projects fund. When those projects start, the fundings could change, the cost of these programs could change. So what we're suggesting is on an annual basis, you need to review how you're gonna fund these projects, if they're gonna happen, and what the actual cost of these projects is, especially when they become delayed.
So in short, this is saying we'll bond for a project. They have the authority to do it. The project moves or doesn't move, eventually stops, or something is delayed. The money sits there, and we do other things, and you still have this authority for something that may or may not be happening, and we don't revisit it to make sure
Right.
it's strategically accounted for.
Right.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, and especially with the expenditure side of things, you originally you decide that this project is gonna cost X. If you start that project 3, 4, 5 years later, it's probably not gonna cost the same. Those estimates are gonna
This
change.
is a finding across all departments? Is that in general?
Yeah, this is related to the capital projects fund, which essentially handles all departments.
Is this, or is one of the things because we sometimes bond for things that we know are coming from the state and we don't get it from the state for a period of time, or is this, no, not related to that? Okay.
More than that,
Okay.
really the departments.
So should it be a more regular practice for projects to be almost like deauthorized, where you say, hey, this project stopped, we don't need the commitment anymore, and clear it off that record?
Or just upgraded?
Basically, do the analysis more timely, not necessarily deauthorize, but, the question becomes, essentially update it. And maybe it results in being deauthorized, but.
Okay.
So the last finding you see there is related to the state DOT. And this was the exact same thing that happened last year. The city submitted 2 reimbursement requests for the same piece of equipment and was reimbursed twice. So kind of shame on the city, but shame on the state too for letting this happen 2 years in a row. Obviously human error, but at the same time, it still needs to be reported.
How much was the 202,000 this time?
Yep.
Last time it was 750,000?
Yeah, it was significantly more last year. Well, if they're gonna pay twice, I don't know. It seems like it could be a good funding stream, but I shouldn't say
It's our
that.
new, what is it, temporary borrowing? We're just
For
gonna,
the land bank.
Right.
no more rands. Just
So again, these findings are things that, although we don't have federal findings this year, this entire reporting package gets uploaded to the federal clearinghouse. Essentially, everyone can see it. When you're going to apply for grants, when your rating agencies are looking at giving you a rating, obviously affects your borrowing costs. These are things that are important, and you essentially want to have your house in order so that someone feels comfortable granting you money. So that's the importance of these findings. I was here earlier when we talked about the lead grants coming back from HUD. We certainly, in the past, have had serious compliance requirements that weren't met by the department, and I'm sure that played into HUD's decision to pull some of those funds. So these things are really important. That HUD grant, I'm sure, will be a major program that will be audited going forward. The fact that we didn't have any findings related to NBD this year is worth noting, because over the past years, we've had significant issues that, aren't there this
The
year.
fact that we didn't have lead money make it less likely that we would have a finding? itself?
Related to lead, yeah, but,
But there were other-
yeah, I mean, we audit,
The HUD money and.
right, you get CDBG, the home program, there's other big programs there that are audited, so. It wasn't just lead that there were findings in, let's put it that way.
So on our end, how much input is involved after the findings on the city's behalf? Like how, I don't want to use the word serious, but how serious do you guys take this, and then what measures do you do to make sure that you can kind of rectify what they found?
Well, a couple of the items Greg spoke to earlier, and I know internally we've spoke to complete the audit sooner. And we will do everything we can. A few years back, we were complete before the school district. They have a 12/31 deadline. We're gonna do everything we can to meet that deadline on our side. The concern is that we all understand, even if we get done sooner, the report will not be issued, and I'll leave that for the auditors to confirm, because we need to incorporate the airport and a variety of other. So the school district gets combined with the city of Syracuse. We include SITA, SETCO's component units, the land bank, I believe, and the airport. And so until all that is done, specifically the airport is what, in the past few years, has gone into the following year. Once that's done, the audit report, the auditors will not issue. So we can get done complete, and that's gonna be one of our goals, and I will do everything I can to pursue that. We've had turnover, we've got less people, we lost one position. We're gonna do everything we can to work on adjusting that. As far as the journal entries, again, I think excluding the airport, water, sewer, these other departments, I just need to sit with them and explain to them how critical it is that we all cooperate in all this. That kind of ties into the capital projects fund request, where many of these departments over the last few years have just ignored what they have. The finding is valid, but we in finance, so if Parks or DPW has been appropriated money by the council, we do what we have to do. The records are set up, but we don't pursue them. And part of what the auditors are saying is those funds are sitting there, they're idle, and you may be approving subsequent appropriations that the funds are already sitting there, so.
So this is an instance where the council could say, hey, you've already been authorized for all of this, what's up with that?
Well, I think it's a fair
before we
question to a
spend more,
department
before
head,
we authorize more?
yeah, if you're asking for additional funds, what's your status? And I know Mary does pursue these departments, but,
This has always been a
Right,
question
right.
on, with the parks, on projects that they've
Right.
had at different parks and whatnot, yeah.
For this year,
Can you use the microphone, please?
sorry. For this year, when the departments have come and requested capital money from me, I've asked them for updates. If you've had previous accounts, where are you with those? And what is your plan for the previous money plus this money? Some of this hasn't come forward to you yet, and it's gone back, because they know that we want to see action on these old projects.
Okay. City clerk?
Over the years, when we had Surstat that was active, this is one of the things that they did, was they had the department heads justify any request before they went to the council, because there are a number of accounts, you'd be amazed. 2 years ago, we did parks, and because I was trying to tell the parks chair, before you authorize new projects, look at what's in the pipeline. There was over $1 million worth of projects sitting there that had been authorized. Some of them were member items that we were being beaten up from the state for not spending the money, which also causes us not to ask for new money. So you really, each chair of the department should have them annually do a report on what are prior capital projects, where's the status of those, before you give them anything new, because, it's better to spend the money you've already appropriated than to ask for new money. I'd also like to ask you, do the land bank as well? Do you look at the land bank's finances?
We do.
What comment do you have on the level of their reserves?
That is a separate audit, but in the.
Are there pages for the land bank in this? Do you know where?
The
roughly
land
you
bank
would-
is included as are they discreetly presented, or are they? So discreetly presented means that it's outside of the primary government, but it's there. We do have, separate audit team does that. Yes, the land bank has been carrying significant fund balance. I can't,
Basically a public benefit corporation,
yes,
so
yeah.
they would fall under the comptroller's rules on how much their fund balance should be.
Yeah, but there's no hard and fast rule on that.
Well, generally not 2 times. the
Can you
operating.
kick, if, can you use the mic to the extent that you go back and forth?
Oh, I don't know of anybody who saves 2 times their operating budget for the reserves.
Right. And again, you know, and I'm not gonna speak to what their plans are, but typically what we would ask is, all right, what is the plan for that? Do you have a 5-year plan to
Ask the
spend that
same
money?
thing. So if you got it, did you get an answer?
I'm not the audit partner on that particular audit, so, that, I'm not gonna speak to that, but again, that's what you would expect of that. So when you see those fund balances accumulate, you would expect, and we do the same thing with towns and villages that accumulate this. All right, what's your capital plan? How do you plan on spending this money?
The only reason I raised the point, as you mentioned earlier with the city audit, the levels that the comptroller thinks are appropriate
Right.
for reserves. And to your point, if the city had large reserves, they're overtaxing people.
Right.
So the same principle applies with the land bank. I mean, if their reserves are 4 million and their operating budget's 2 million a year, I don't think you could find many examples of that in the state of New York.
Probably not. And again, the land bank is, you know, not to make excuses for anyone, the land bank's a relatively newer entity, so they do need to have those plans in place to spend that fund balance.
Other questions?